Hello, I'm Jeremy Rossman, and in this episode of The Long Haul, we'll be talking with Inez Jabalpurwala from Vinex about research into the neurological effects of COVID. Inez, it's great to have you on today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. To begin with, could you tell me a little bit about your background and how you got into long COVID research?
Certainly, I am the founding CEO of a brain research organization in Canada, a role that I left after 19 years. And I was approached at that time by one of the principals of a private medical device company called Rocket Science Health that has been developing devices for direct nose to brain drug delivery. And when the company was established in 2017, they had a social impact priority focus on pandemic preparedness. So they thought, well, what's interesting about SARS-CoV-2 is that this is a respiratory virus that may find itself in other parts of the human system, including the brain. And so we partnered together and thought, this is a really interesting idea to pursue, to look at what is the emerging evidence base around whether SARS-CoV-2 is in fact impacting the central nervous system, and also looking historically at other viruses and seeing if there was an evidence base that would support this. So we launched Vinex, which is short for Viral Neuroexploration, last April, and became an independent, separate, non-for-profit corporation in November. And our first task really was to assemble scientific leadership, which we did across Canada and into the US, that could bridge together virologists, neurologists, immunologists, and data scientists in order to better understand that intersection of what is really virology, immunology, and impacts on brain that require neurology and neuroscience expertise. So that's how we got started. And what we did as we evolved was take on a bigger role in being a catalyst around understanding issues that were central to patients. So while the early years were really spent, the early 8 months rather, were really spent on trying to understand the science, we had to start looking at what is the patient experience. And that's how long COVID got on our radar. We started to see more stories about people who were living with lasting and long-term impacts of COVID-19. And they were frustrated because they felt they weren't being heard. And so for Vinex, it was a natural place for us to be a kind of bridge to bring together the scientific expertise and knowledge that we had developed, along with the patient experiences and voices, and look at how do we work together to establish what are going to be the research and care priorities, and then how do we work towards ensuring that we're putting more support into these areas.
That's excellent. I mean, of course, this is so needed right now. But I also really appreciate that perspective and focus of trying to bring in all these different disciplines that don't normally talk to each other to really have that very broad perspective that's needed for such a complicated disease.
Yes.
Excellent. So, looking at the effect of SARS-CoV-2 on the brain, what is your perspective on sort of the state of the field? What do we generally know about what SARS-CoV-2 does to the brain?
So let me start with some historical data, which I think was quite compelling when we started our venture. And that is going right back to the Russian flu and the Spanish flu. So in the Spanish flu of 1918 to 1920, 1/3 of the global population was impacted. And a number of researchers post that pandemic began to notice that there seemed to be an increase in cases of neurological and psychiatric disorders. And the same observations had been made in 1889 during the Russian flu. But of course, the technology was not developed at that point to be able to do the kind of large scale clinical analyses and trials that would be required to understand the phenomena. But there were a number of theories that were circulated, including possible linkage to Parkinson's disease. And we've seen that with MERS and with SARS-CoV-1, that in fact there's enough evidence that the virus is moving around the body. And so even if it's a respiratory virus, it doesn't stay in the respiratory system. So we already had that evidence base. And then there was a study done in Wuhan, China, of 214 patients, all of them hospitalized. But what they found was after the period when they would normally be recovered, about 1/3 of them had persistent neurological impacts. And these were observed in Wuhan, but then in smaller observational studies that were happening in other countries. So there's starting to be this emerging sense that, well, we know historically that viruses do actually have this ability to move through the system. And now we have evidence that maybe something is happening with this virus. And so what we need is to actually do some more study. And so early on, we looked at two studies that emerged shortly after these initial observational ones. One was done in New York City, Langone, which found that 1 in 7 patients who had been infected had some kind of a neurological impact. And then there was a study out of Oxford, which found that 1 in 5 people had been diagnosed with a psychiatric disorder within 3 months of the infection. And that included anxiety, depression, and insomnia. So there started to be some more work that was very specifically targeting what are some of these brain impacts. And more recently, there's been some study. The British Medical Journal has published a study looking at neuropsychiatric and neurological symptoms of COVID-19. There's been an international patient-led study of long COVID that found that 85% of people infected and living with long COVID had cognitive impacts or brain fog, memory, concentration issues. And I think one of the most compelling studies, which was just published as a preprint out of Oxford a few weeks ago, was a study that looked at MRI brain scans of a set of patients, so about 400 patients whose scans were recorded before and after they were infected with a virus against a baseline of patients who never had COVID-19. And what they found was that there was significant decrease of gray matter in certain areas. And interestingly, they affected smell and taste, memory, and emotion. So all of a sudden, what was thought to be potentially something that might have been a secondary effect, and maybe the virus gets in the brain, maybe it doesn't. Now there looks like there's actual evidence that it could, in fact, reach the central nervous system, reach the brain. We don't know how that might happen, and I think that the authors hypothesized that it might be through the olfactory, but they didn't have any evidence of this. But there's definitely something that is happening. So there's quite a bit more information now that's available, and I think that we're looking at both the direct and the indirect impacts, but we know there's definitely something to the early observational studies that potentially something was happening to the brain.
Yeah, that was a very interesting study because we've been hearing a lot about that. One of the symptoms that we're seeing sort of earlier on and can be very persistent is anosmia, which is the loss of smell or even the change of sense of smell. And that is one really interesting way in which if the virus was entering the CNS, this may be a link between what we're seeing in terms of early symptoms and this potential impact in the brain and the CNS. So it's a very interesting because we do see a lot of this symptoms reports and symptom studies, but having a little bit of potential mechanistic link and sort of that physiological data, I think is a very, very interesting study.
It is because, one of the big questions was just because there are some neurological or psychiatric impact, it doesn't mean that the virus is actually in the brain. So, and there may be an indirect impact and, an immune response or an inflammation, a neuroinflammatory response. So that could explain that maybe it somehow triggers this, but it doesn't actually end up in the central nervous system. And although there have been studies on autopsy brains, they haven't been that conclusive. So, this is actually quite compelling because it's on live brains, it's MRI scans of people who are still with us. And so we can find a lot more about what's actually happening in the brain.
Absolutely, and it's such a rarity to be able to match a MRI scan from before COVID with after COVID and see that change. Of course, the next step will be saying, okay, so we see that change in the brain, but what is the impact? What does that actually mean on patient health? And is that something that is persistent? So it's a start of a very interesting line of hopefully continued research.
It is, and I think when we look at links that have already been established with different viruses, herpes, HIV, Japanese encephalitis, various influenzas, and potentially looking even at triggers to neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, ALS, MS. You start to see that there's a possibility that the impacts are going to be longer term, that maybe, we're looking at certain consequences now, but maybe those consequences, are shorter term, but there's something that's happening to the brain that is only going to manifest over a longer time horizon. So I think that also brings to the question of why longitudinal studies are important, because it's not just capturing a moment in time, it's looking at, what over the course of a lifespan could happen if you've been infected by this virus. And that's a really interesting question. And I would add that we have this unique opportunity because we have this large number of people all over the world infected by the same virus at roughly the same time. It gives us a lot to work with, in terms of research in being able to capture robust data, because the challenge is always if you can't get a robust data sampling. And with long COVID, it's even more problematic. You have so many symptoms, the number I've seen numbers like 200 different symptoms reported. You need to have enough data to work with to be able to start to stratify, and segment this data and the patients and understand better, how these different segments have been impacted.
Yeah, and it's such an important point, and such a, when we're talking about trying to get to a real patient impact, a real patient benefit, making sure that we're looking as broadly across the world and getting the largest data that we can so that we can actually have that impact as soon as possible, because we don't want to wait years to see what the long-term impact is. We want to have something that can be done soon.
Yes, and that's always a challenge, that the short-term immediate need to have answers and to have care strategies, but then taking the long view of really understanding what's happening, because it will give us insight in general about how viruses may impact the brain. And that's really important. But also, and we hope this doesn't happen, but if there's a future pandemic, maybe this time around we'll be better along and we'll have answers, and we won't feel that we're turning away patients and not having any kind of option for them or any hope in terms of what a potential treatment could look like. So all of that, to me, is quite promising. Now, I think there's been some movement, certainly on the funding level. I think the US has been really a leader in terms of being, declaring, as Dr. Fauci had, that this is a public health crisis, holding a workshop on long COVID last December, and then the NIH announcing $1.15 billion for research and care. But the UK has also stepped up and, through its own government agencies and allocated 18.5 million pounds for research and another 10 million pounds for a network of clinics. So, we're seeing that there's actually money now that's matched the need, and at least a validation to all of those people who are living with long COVID that we need to do better in terms of finding answers. I think we've been a bit slower in Canada in terms of targeting specific funding, but in our last open call competition, our Canadian Institutes of Health Research have allocated funds through their COVID-19 budget to be looking at understanding long COVID and specifically getting to a better definition of what long COVID really is.
That's really good to hear. This is really significant progress, actually being able to have funding dedicated to this and, from multiple countries is a really big step. Of course, it's still a very long process to get to those answers. But, if you look at sort of what, Vinex is working on, so what kind of studies is Vinex doing? How are they sort of approaching this idea of neuro-COVID research?
So, as we had done, a lot of the back-end work in trying to understand from the clinical and scientific and research perspective, history and what do we currently understand, we equally put value in trying to better understand people with lived experience. And we're at a unique place because we have been able to bridge these two. And research, care, priority setting has to be done as a bidirectional dialogue with people with lived experience. Otherwise, we're just looking at whether people live or die, and that doesn't tell us the full story of the impact of any disease or pandemic. And I think that was absent for a long time because the focus was really on the science and it wasn't about the patient experience. And so we partnered with the COVID Long Hauler Support Group Canada and Neurological Health Charities Canada. And what we thought would be really important was, while there were stories that were starting to emerge that were very patient-focused about experience, we needed to put some numbers behind these stories. And so we conducted what is still the largest survey of Canadians living with long COVID from coast to coast, to better understand what are their experiences and how is it impacting their quality of life. So looking at measures like their ability to work or how often they're accessing the healthcare system and whether they are receiving treatment and care, and trying to better understand how it's impacting their families and their whole lives. So for us, this was quite important because it really started to crystallize that this is not just something that impacts a few individuals. Now, we'd already seen the numbers that the estimates are between 25 and 35% of people with COVID-19 will be living with long COVID. And in Canada, those numbers represent about 350,000 to just over 490,000 people who at one time may have been living with or are currently still living with long COVID. That's really significant in terms of impact on a healthcare system and on the labor force. So our survey reached over 1,000 people, and we ran it over a period from May 5th to May 26th. So we allowed a certain amount of time to collect this information. And we also allowed some open-ended questions to just get a feel for some of the patient experiences that we're reporting. And it was interesting because what we found also matched some of the findings around the world. So in terms of the top symptoms, cognitive impairment or brain fog was among the top three, along with fatigue and shortness of breath. So, chronic fatigue was certainly the top. There was no question that this debilitating fatigue that people are feeling, is predominant among people living with long COVID. And then there were other brain impacts that, with different degrees, like headaches and dizziness and anxiety. And again, pretty much matched what was being discovered elsewhere. But when we looked at the impact on workplace, what we found was that 60% of people had to leave work. And 70% had to reduce their working hours. And of that segment, about 74% for more than 50% of their time. So that's a hidden cost that we haven't really talked about much in Canada. And it is significant because they're accessing, either government programs or other ways, or in some cases, they're maybe not able to step away from the workforce. And so they're working even though they have a really compromised quality of life and health. So that was quite a significant finding. And then we found the number of people that were accessing the healthcare system was actually quite dramatic. So, we saw people going to healthcare visits sometimes 5 times, sometimes more than 10 times, because they were going back and back and, they had recurring symptoms, or they were trying to get answers and they weren't getting answers in one place and they're having to go elsewhere. And that again has a real impact because they're accessing the healthcare system and they're still not able to get satisfaction or any kind of option of treatment. And so they're going to keep going back. And so we've got to change that cycle. And it has, it is going to have even more pressure down the line, because not only will we have these large number of people who are living with long COVID, but there's a backlog in the medical system of other treatments that have not been happening. In Canada, we have a backlog of surgeries, treatment for cancer, for example. And then there's a whole issue of frontline workers, because there are many who actually have been infected with COVID, and now a subset who are living with long COVID, and some of them have had to step away from work or reduce their hours. So that further puts pressure on the whole healthcare system. So it's really, a much bigger issue when you start to look at all the different ways that long COVID is impacting our society and our economy, in addition to what it's doing at the individual level, where, the stories can be devastating. And you see people who were, highly functioning individuals, because long COVID mostly impacts people in their middle years and disproportionately women. And so when you look at what that is going to mean, down the line, it is going to have a significant impact on the well-being of a large segment of our population.
Absolutely. I mean, I've been reading a little bit more that's saying, people are already starting to come off of, disability insurance and coverage from the government. And, this is not a short-term effect. This is not something that just, a couple months of coverage and then people are cured and can just sort of go back to their lives. Some people are recovering, and that's wonderful. But, what about the people that aren't recovering? And, what sort of not only awareness and recognition of that, but support is being provided at a governmental level. And, some countries, have, much better awareness, but, support is a whole nother level.
Yes, and as you mentioned, disability, it's not obvious that you can claim disability benefits, because this is so ill-defined at this stage. And, we found a quarter of our respondents said they were on disability, but then there's also others who it's possible that they tried to access disability and could not, or just don't have access to disability coverage of any kind. So it's a real issue. And I think, the thing that concerns me the most is people who are having no options but to present at a workplace when in fact, they are having difficulty functioning, and they should have the time they need to properly recover, because, this may not be short-term for some people. And we found that, 3 months in, there were a number of people who were still living with impacts, but we also found a large segment that were 8, 11 months and out. So it can be really long-term. It can be months, it can be a year, and it might be longer for some. And there was some hope around the vaccines that maybe, because in some individuals it seemed to be the case that their long COVID symptoms were diminished once they had the vaccine. But there's also been a number in that segment who have relapsed now. So we don't actually know what impact the vaccine will have in terms of mitigating the symptoms or providing some kind of a treatment for long COVID. And we don't know yet, because it hasn't been studied, whether the vaccine will prevent long COVID in the future. So there's still some questions around, whether a vaccine is going to be the answer for those who are living with long COVID.
Yeah, exactly. And, we've actually had one of our previous episodes, we were actually talking about the vaccines and the impact on long COVID. And, there's clearly potential there, because there are patients that are reporting benefit and a positive change in symptoms, but it's not everybody. And so, we don't yet understand, why that is, or what would distinguish between, patients that are going to respond positively versus patients that might have a worsening of symptoms. And that is really a needed component. But as you mentioned, do the vaccines prevent long COVID? There's a very limited amount of data out there that is saying, okay, there seems to be a reduction of people that are reporting persistent symptoms, but it seems like it's just a reduction, and we don't have that really good data set yet to go with all the clinical trial data that says the vaccines are safe and efficacious in the broad population. But what about long COVID? I think it's a really important data set that we don't have yet.
Yes.
So, a lot of this is talking about this idea that you had mentioned, this sort of longitudinal study, saying that, what we're seeing right now is just a snapshot. But, how does that not only change over time for patients, because we hear so much about how, symptoms really change. Sometimes it's getting worse, sometimes it's getting better, sometimes it's changing which symptoms are presenting and which combinations. But what the sort of long-term outlook is like. So you've mentioned longitudinal studies. So are you and Vinex doing any longitudinal studies, or are there any longitudinal studies that you're aware of that they're really excited about?
So there are studies that are happening that are looking longer term. And I think, certainly in Canada, because we're just starting to get funding now to do these studies, It's limited at this time because of the clinical trial budget in our open competition is about $1 million, and that's not going to be enough. There is work, though, underway in Quebec that we hope we'll be able to announce shortly to get a proper study funded that is going to look in general at impacts of long COVID, but specifically add a brain component, which will look at cognitive testing and potentially and hopefully imaging for subset that we feel need to have a deeper analysis. So there is some good news, and I think with all the money that I've described from the US and the UK, I do think there are going to be more of these studies. I think it's great that, you know, the big study that came out on the imaging, it draws on the UK Biobank, and I think that when you have some of these structures already in place that have been tracking patients, there's an opportunity here to be able to dovetail a study of long COVID onto a pre-existing study that is already taking a long view and gives you some kind of baseline measure. So I think there is some optimism I'm feeling about more attention and the ability to do this. But I do think that, you know, what we have to emphasize is you need to have really robust data collection. And it's not enough to fund a series of smallish studies and feel that the job is done, because most of these studies are actually leading to more questions. And so what we really need to do is think about how global collaboration can be facilitated. You mentioned earlier, and this is a real preoccupation of mine, most clinical trials are still conducted in developing countries. But, you know, we know that there's biological and non-biological variability, which may well impact risk factors or outcomes. And so we need to be thinking about how do we engage low and middle income countries in data collection. They may not be able to run large scale trials in their country that can simply connect and, you know, through interoperable data, but they may well, you know, in a tiered model, be able to provide data and help with formulating the research questions and priorities that are relevant for their context. And I think that's going to be really important if we truly understand that this is a global pandemic, and so it's affected countries around the world. And it is in our interest collectively and the interest of humanity that we not leave behind entire societies because they aren't necessarily equipped to be able to do this work. So I think for me, that's going to be really important that we enroll and engage at a global level and collect robust data. And that data is going to enable us to be able to better understand and define what long COVID is, understand the different risk factors and how different communities may be impacted, and then be able to draw some conclusions and pursue some new hypotheses if we have some analytical tools and maybe can harness the power of AI and machine learning to do that. And finally, I would say that we have to collectively share not just our data, but our tools, and be able to ensure that these insights get translated in some ways into our healthcare systems. Because, you know, part of the challenge for patients is this is a complex constellation that happens with long COVID. It's not going to be just one kind of treatment that will work. And every individual, you know, the more personalized we can tailor these approaches, obviously the better the outcomes. But minimally, we're looking at what will be multidisciplinary approaches to treatment and care. I think that, it means that we have to be working in a more collaborative framework.
Yeah, absolutely. And that sort of international collaborative framework, I think, is so important because, you know, we work with a lot of different collaborative organizations supporting long COVID patients. But, you know, the thing that, you know, we hear over and over and over again is how few countries long COVID is actually being recognized in. And so there are so many countries where there's really no support for long COVID patients, let alone that sort of data collection and data analysis. So we have a lot of long COVID data right now that is coming from a very limited amount of countries. And so we don't have that global perspective of what is that disease like in other cultures, in other communities, in other countries around the world. And I completely agree. I think that this is such an important thing, both in terms of supporting patients, as well as having that much broader perspective of what is this disease and how do we actually treat it in a way that doesn't leave patients behind?
Yes, and partly I think this whole challenge of, well, women are disproportionately impacted. Now, we don't understand why, and there may be some issues that are tied around that in terms of who presents, at clinics or who's part of these social media groups. But nonetheless, the evidence is there. And, we don't have a great track record in the history of medicine in difficult to diagnose illnesses that primarily impact women. Because, when you go back, it wasn't that far ago that they were called hysterical or hypochondriac when they presented with mental health issues, for example. And certainly chronic fatigue syndrome is one that, often is cited. So I think that, part of the acknowledgement that you mentioned is really about giving recognition to the voices of people with lived experience, and recognizing that just because we don't have the ability right now to properly diagnose it or label it or bring it to a definition that we can all sort of action around, doesn't mean that it's imagined. And I think what has been really impactful in this crisis is social media has enabled people with lived experience to organize and to connect and to amplify their voices. And that has really been a game changer in my view, because it really hasn't happened, in the past at this scale, where there is enough, evidence now that we can see, wait a minute, we're all experiencing very similar symptoms. So we're not all imagining it. We're not all hysterical. We're not all hypochondriacs. There is something to this. And I think that's really helped shape the idea that we can't leave people behind because we don't really value compromised quality of life. We think that if people look basically okay, or I've heard stories of people being told, just be happy you're not dead. Why are you complaining? You've survived the virus. So this is not serious, when they can barely function, and they have a quality of life that is really a shadow of their former quality of life. To me, that's what's important that we take away from this, that the patient experience, the experience of people with lived experience, the voices of those who actually are supposed to be the beneficiaries of all this research, they have to be part of the dialogue from the very beginning in understanding what is important in research. And when we set research priorities, early on it was about vaccine development, and of course that was appropriate. But we've got to think about what are the priorities now that are going to make a meaningful difference to the lives of these people? And how do we make sure that we don't lose sight of this importance as time goes by and we start to feel good about the fact that we're well vaccinated and we're reemerging and life seems to look like it's normal again, that we don't just forget about this whole subset of people. And I think that's a challenge for those of us who do have voices. We have to keep that pressure on. Otherwise, I'm afraid that as soon as the headlines are gone, we're going to end up with a chronic disease that essentially is forgotten.
I think that is such an important point, and such, this is why it's so inspiring to be talking to, all the people involved in both in research and advocacy and patient support, because there are so many people that are speaking out, that are continuing to speak out. And it's so important that that is maintained into the future. So with what you just said, that's a perfect lead into my last question for you here, which is just to say, from a patient perspective, considering the research that's ongoing, that's been done recently, what do you see as the outlook on sort of that patient focused side? What's the outlook that you see in terms of near term and maybe a little bit farther down the road?
Well, I hope that this does translate into a recognition that we do need to have specialized, if not clinics of care, then certainly the capacity within our existing clinics to be able to serve people that do present with long COVID symptoms. And even if they're difficult to diagnose, that they still need to be heard, and there still needs to be an effort to look at whatever information we do have available. Can we begin some kind of rehabilitation process for them? And just being acknowledged and heard is very powerful in the care continuum. And I think that, it's so often forgotten. We think, well, because we don't have something to offer them, then we just won't offer them anything. Sometimes what they actually need to be offered is compassion. And we just, we don't have enough time for it sometimes. And I think it's really such a critical part of care. And I spent a lot of my time talking to people with lived experience. I have my whole career. It's been really the part of my work in these last 20 years that's been the most rewarding, because when you actually sit down and listen to people and their experiences, you come away with a really much better understanding that research is not this great intellectual endeavor. In the absence of serving people, it's just asking a bunch of questions for curiosity. And we have to really bring it back to what the purpose is. And it will make us ask different questions, because I see even in the last couple of decades, in the early years, there was a singular focus on cures. Everything was about, we need to get to cures. And then I met someone a quadriplegic, who said to me, I am tired of people telling me every time I meet them, oh, keep the faith, we're working on a cure, when I would just like to regain enough mobility to brush my own teeth, because I have a good quality of life, but I would like to have some agency over my life. And that to me would be important. And I think that's doable. Or maybe a better wheelchair, or some piece of equipment that helps somebody regain their voice when they're starting to lose it. We forget that there are things we can do to improve quality of life that are within our lifetime. And we have to broaden sort of our understanding of the value of research, and thinking about what are things between now and the cure that we can do that will actually make a difference. And the only way to understand that is when you talk to people and you understand what their needs are. And I hope that that becomes the way that we do all of our research, because often we talk about patient-centered, but it doesn't mean just talking about what patients that you think that they need. Patient-centered means listening to what they actually need.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that is so critical, so important. And this is not something that is just for long COVID. This is a change that is needed throughout research, and how research is done, and how research can be done. I think this is a challenge, but this is also really an opportunity to make some system changes that can benefit patients for the long time, and not just in terms of long COVID.
Yes, and to not see this, as a continuum, but as an ecosystem. And I think, the power of the Long COVID Alliance, for example, and the voice that they had to government, and that changed, perspectives and opinions and led to actions, had to do with being able to connect all of these different players who all said, we're in the same ecosystem. Like, we need to figure out, how do we join together and think through, what are the priorities, and what is the plan of action? What do we actually need? And that takes shape. And, I'm such a believer in the power of bringing science and the people with lived experience perspectives together, because I think one without the other, doesn't actually build a compelling case. You need both, because you need to know, what we do know and what we need to understand. And that is the science part. And then you need to know what's important for us from a quality of life standpoint. If you can bring those together and have a coherent vision, then I think you have something that's pretty powerful. And hopefully it does galvanize governments and other funders into action, and into a commitment that they will do better, because now they know what needs to get done.
I really hope so. I really hope so. Well, thank you very much. It's been wonderful to have you on. Thank you for all your words and your perspective and the work that you're doing. It's been great to have you on today.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you.